Hello everyone, my name is Joe Grayland. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Palmerston North, Director of Liturgy for the Diocese, and I have a background in professional education and in professional theology. It's my pleasure to offer this reflection for you on the document called Sacrosanctum Concilium and its value for today. So, to begin with, a couple of points which I think are important to note. Sacrosanctum Concilium was written back in the 1960s. It's not intended to answer all of the problems, liturgical questions that we have today. Just as the scriptures were written thousands of years ago without any knowledge of democracy or nuclear weapons or capitalism or globalization, so they can't answer those questions. Our task here is to look at the principles of the document itself and understand how they can be applied today, because that's important for the whole of the document. So, to begin with, very simply, the document is there to increase the vigour of the faithful. So at the end of number 4, it says, the Council desires that, where necessary, the rites be revised carefully in the light of sound tradition, and that they be given new vigour to meet present-day circumstances and needs. That's number 4. So let's take that as our beginning point. When we come to number 7 in the document, it tells us that Christ is present in his church, especially in the liturgical celebration, in the celebration of the Mass, in the Eucharistic elements, in the scriptures when they are proclaimed, in the people who are present in the assembly, the baptized, and in the presence of the minister who leads them. And so those 4 presences are unique to Vatican II. They have never been articulated in that same way before that. They're articulated in that way from the Second Vatican Council in order that we might understand that this is a corporate work that we are all doing, and this is a work that is Christ's work first, in which we engage. So then the liturgy is always seen as the work of the priestly office of Christ, in which men and women are sanctified through the use of symbols that they understand and through the use of gesture and posture that is appropriate to each culture. And so as we go through that, we understand that the liturgy, whilst the work of Christ, is not the only thing that the church does, but it is the preeminent sacred action. And so as we go through and understand that liturgy is the summit towards which the activity of the church is directed and the source out of which the church operates, we begin to get a different appreciation of how we participate in it. So this is one of the things that's important. First point, relevant for today, that liturgy in the tradition of the Second Vatican Council, the Pauline liturgy of Pope Paul VI, unlike the liturgy that went before it, it promotes, requires, and desires the strong participation of the people of God. Liturgy, when we celebrate it now, is not only the work of the priest. In the previous ritual, the 1962 ritual, a priest could say the Mass almost entirely on his own, though he was required to have a server. But he celebrated and said all of the words of the Mass, even when in the latter part of the 1960s and even back into the 50s, when people would read parts of the Mass in the vernacular, English or French or whatever it was. The priest still read and was required to read everything in Latin. Now we celebrate that together. An example is that when it comes to the prayers of the faithful, the intentions of the prayers of the faithful are never read or said by the priest. So the priest is to say, let us now pray our prayers of the faithful, and then be silent. The intentions are then either read by a deacon or a lay lector or by people generally. And then at the end he says, these are our prayers through Christ our Lord. It's quite wrong for the priest to say, we'll pray for this, we'll pray for that, we'll pray for the next thing. And if you've got anything else you want to add, you can do that now. So the point there, of course, is to say that the participation by the laity is not an arbitrary thing. It is an essential element. And that is supported in the Second Vatican Council, in its document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, from number 14 through to number 19. You can see that this is picked up in later documents by the Council as well, that there is a desire that the people of God are actually deeply involved in the work of God, in the work of worship, and in the sanctification and salvation of the world. We see that in documents like Ad Gentes Divinitus. So as we go through, we understand that priests and laity need to be formed in order to participate. So point 2. The relevance for today is the extent to which people are prepared to participate in the way that they are formed to participate, so that they understand that participation is not singing a song and saying a prayer or giving a child something to carry up the aisle. They're all nice and they're good, but they're the minimal level. The real participation is that the people understand and know by their posture and their gesture, by their words and their song, that they are engaged in the work of God, and that they are there in the place where salvation is happening for them, and from that place where they experience salvation, they will take that message to others. Therefore, the whole structure of the Mass needs to be much more missionary focused. It needs to be much more outward focused. It's not about making people comfortable to be there. It's about making people ready to be somewhere else. So then if we go further into this document and we go past the reform and the need for it, we come to number 33, which is the norms on the educative and pastoral nature of the liturgy. For in the liturgy, God speaks to his people. Christ is proclaiming his gospel, and the people respond to God both in song and in prayer. That's the last part of number 33. And so what's important is that when we understand that that is the depth of what we're doing, then the first part of number 33 becomes important. Although the sacred liturgy is principally the worship of divine majesty, it likewise contains much instruction for the faithful. And so if you have a read of paragraph 1 of number 33, you'll see that there are a couple of points there. One is that the liturgy does instruct. It catechizes us. So the good liturgies we go to teach us how to worship. The bad ones we go to repulse us and tell us how we're not going to worship. The struggle or the challenge that we have is that as we want to make things authentic and also more contemporary, we run the risk of creating bad liturgical expressions, which then take many generations to work through the system. I'll give you an example. Over recent years, probably the last 10, if not 20 years, the dynamic of the funeral has changed, especially for Catholic people. At one time, there was never questioned that a Catholic being buried by their Catholic family would have what we called a requiem mass, or a mass of Christian burial. Now it is very unusual for people, even practicing Catholics, to be buried by their Catholic children and in-laws using a mass of Christian burial. It's become more obvious and more often the case that people are being buried with a liturgy of burial. That in itself is not a problem. However, what happens then is that in many of these liturgies, influenced by sources outside of the church, of course, in funeral parlours and non-denominational, nondescript public worship or civil worship, The scriptures have been replaced by poems. Eulogies and tributes have taken on the central form of the whole event. And at the end of it, often prayers are not even prayed. But the problem is that in burying people, one has the experience that one is burying a living saint. And there is no understanding that the person being buried is as fallible and as broken as everybody else sitting in the pews. And therefore, what the church's ritual does is acknowledges before God and everybody else that the person in the casket is as much in need of salvation as anybody else sitting there. And so our understanding is that we enter with humility into the presence of God, acknowledging our sin and understanding our weakness and brokenness. But a lot of our contemporary forms of funerals don't allow that truth to be expressed, because there is a far greater fear of death and a far greater fear of a person's failure than we are able to acknowledge. Take again the wedding. It's always interesting to me that people who want a wedding, not in a church and not with a priest, but on a paddock or at the beach, immediately set up little rows of chairs, create an aisle, put a table at one end to create the altar, and they have done the one thing outdoors that they could have done inside without having to worry about the weather. And the irony of all of this is lost on them. Or again, when it comes to the wedding ceremony, the bride walking in her white dress on her father's arm to meet her groom at the steps is a whole symbolization of a package of humanity owned by one man being taken in on the arm to be given to another man who will own that package of humanity, whom we call woman. The Christian liturgy, the Catholic liturgy, instead, has the couple either come to the church together or meet at the church door together, be greeted by the priest, and they are led into the church by the priest in the procession as two equal people. They arrive at the foot of the altar as two equal people. There is no mercantile aspect to that. But I find it always astounding that some of the most sophisticated young women cannot understand the mercantile symbolization of the first and don't want the freedom of equality of the second. So there is an issue here in terms of the to be valuable for today. People actually need to be informed and instructed in some of the deeper meaning of the liturgy. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't get it because they understand liturgy as ritual bits and pieces, songs and prayers and things you put together that have no real relationship to each other, rather than understanding that the liturgy is symbolizing their salvation. So what are some practical terms? So this is when you turn further to number 37 and especially number 38, but it goes on to number 40, which is around adapting the liturgy to the temperament and traditions of peoples. So this is a very important line here. Even in the liturgy, the Church does not wish to impose a rigid uniformity in matters which do not affect the faith or the well-being of the entire community. That's powerful. People often think we are rigid uniformists, but we're not. The liturgy, because it includes the people at a deep and substantial level, and because it is engaging the people at that level, means that those of you in schools and in parishes who are then animators of liturgy need to understand that before you can animate a liturgy, before you can put the component parts together, you actually need to sit down and ask yourself, do I know the people who gather? And if you do, fantastic. If you don't, stop. Because otherwise you will inflict a rigid uniformity. So what happens in the school is that it can become a uniformity of pedagogy, so that everything is a pedagogical moment. Let's teach somebody something. And you transfer that to the church, and the worship on Sunday is basically a pedagogical moment. There is no sacramentality in it of any depth. Alternatively, you could, in the parish, have a deep mystical experience of liturgy and understanding of it, and design it for people who are daily communicants and a lot older with mystical experience. And suddenly you bring in a group of children and their parents, and they have no idea what's going on because their prayer life has not taken them to that level yet. And so therefore you need to have symbols that step them through. You need to have understanding of here a little bit of education, there an activity, here is a symbol, and the three things together begin to allow us to worship at some depth. So then the next one, the church cultivates and fosters qualities and talents of the various races and nations. Again, you've got a multilingual, multi-ethnic church community or school community. So therefore, the challenge then is how all of that culture and those cultural differences can become one together without becoming separate things, one thing that follows another. So here's a Maori bit, here's a Pākehā bit, here's a Samoan bit, here's a Tokelauan bit, here's a Chinese bit. And so what you've ended up with is a liturgy of bits of pieces, but there's no cohesion between them. It's a little bit like in music. How do you find the leitmotif that takes you from the beginning to the end of the piece? And that is probably the biggest challenge that we face in multi-ethnic, multicultural countries and churches and parishes and schools as in New Zealand. And as that becomes more and more our norm, our ability to understand that will become much more important. So, the last part of this, anything in a people's, a tribe's, a people's way of life, which is not indissolubly bound up with superstition, so it isn't full of superstition or error, the church studies with sympathy and, if possible, preserves intact. So therefore it becomes important when you are looking at all of the various ethnic groups and their expressions, look for one thing. Is it bound up with superstition? Is it ancestor worship masquerading as the glory of the saints? Is it some other sacrificial thing going on which has got nothing to do with Eucharist? Is there a hierarchy of people here that's been played out which has got nothing to do with the unity of brothers and sisters in baptism? So if those things are there, you need to get rid of them. You need to challenge them. But if they aren't bound up with that, if there is genuine depth, huge belief, an expression of the deity and the divinity, then you begin to study them with sympathy, simpatico. So that's not with sympathy, oh, I'm sorry to hear somebody died or something, but it's actually with a genuine openness, an open-heartedness. And if possible, preserve it intact. So the last part of number 37, it sometimes even means admitting such things into the liturgy itself on the proviso that they harmonize with the liturgy's true and authentic spirit. And to find the true and authentic spirit, you go back again to the beginning. The Council desires that wherever necessary, the rites be revised carefully in the light of sound tradition, and that they be given new vigour to meet the present day circumstances and needs. Thank you for listening.